moving forward. So let's sort of finish up with a little bit of specificity around performance assessment and sort of shape some conversation. We'll have a final talk time, and then we'll have some closing comments, and we'll finish up as close to 5:30 as we can, because it's important that we do that. Now, one of the things that I want to submit to you when it comes to, again, our assessment fundamentals. Our assessment fundamentals will, as we move, as many of you out there are moving toward performance assessment, project-based learning, problem-based learning, et cetera, you're going to engage yourselves in more performance assessment. And as I mentioned earlier, by definition, a performance assessment is essentially performance assessments or demonstrations of mastery that attempt to emulate the context or the conditions in which the intended knowledge or skills are actually applied. A performance assessment isn't always a project. It isn't always something that is demonstrated. It's all of it. Even solving equations can be a performance task or a performance assessment if what you're asking the students to do has a level of authenticity to it. Because, for example, in society, engineers solve equations. So it isn't as though as soon as you do something on paper, it's suddenly inapplicable. It's the authenticity of what we're asking students to do that makes it. So the lines are a bit blurry, but one of the reasons that performance assessment gets separated from, say, constructed response in the literature is because of its depth and breadth and the number of outcomes or standards that we're trying to accomplish. So performance assessment, I think this is one of the interesting ways to think about performance assessment. One, the reason we continue to move toward more performance assessment is because performance assessment is really about demonstrations that don't fit other formats. You can essentially boil down all assessment into three formats. There's selected response, there's constructed response, and then there's performance assessment. So one of the reasons that we highlight performance assessment is because, quite honestly, the demonstration of learning doesn't fit selected response or constructed response. Okay? So we're going to continue to increase our use in performance assessment. Remember that when we are assessment literate, we understand that no assessment method is in and of itself problematic. There is a place for multiple choice, but it's limited. There is a place for constructed response, but it's limited. And there is a place for performance assessment, but it's limited. So when I'm assessment literate, I understand how to select the most appropriate method to elicit the most accurate evidence so I can make a proper judgment about where students are and what they need to do next. So this isn't about dismissing formats. This is about being thoughtful about which format we choose. Two, we also know that what performance assessments offer is they actually offer an enriching learning experience. So project-based learning isn't just about what you produce on the back end. It's also about what you experience in the doing. The creation of an inquiry question and a deep dive into something that you are sort of deeply curious about, that experience in and of itself, not just the end result, but the process of going through that experience is enriching, and it's not just about serving as an indicator. So there was a point where we were talking a lot, and this isn't to discredit this, because this is an important part, but a lot of us over the years have been talking about kids being able to show us what they know in differentiated ways, right? So here's the learning we're focused on, but you show me what you know in a differentiated way. That's kind of the indicator of learning that is being referenced in number 2. And that is important. And this is helpful because the indicators of learning are really about the learning. So even when you do problem-based or project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, you don't need to have 7 to 12 different rubrics, because your rubric really is focused on what learning is being demonstrated. The task is what's going to elicit that evidence for you. So I always call it the death spiral, the death by rubric spiral, where every time you change tasks, you create a new rubric. And we've got binders on our shelves filled with rubrics, and the kids are trying to cross-reference them on some XY axis of what rubric are we using today, Mr. Schimmer. The more task-neutral we can make our rubrics and the more we can focus them on what learning is being demonstrated, the more transferable those rubrics become. And third, what performance assessment helps us do, it brings about instructional practices and models to us, continually going through that, what's important for us to teach and what is important for students to learn. Now, performance assessment, again, is both incredibly important, but also challenging, because the easy part of the equation is to say to students, hey, you can show me what you know in any way that you want. The challenge, of course, is if the student shows me what they know in a way that I'm not able to infer proficiency or quality, then I might not recognize how proficient or how limited their understanding is. So, example, students make a video or they make a board game or they do something like that. That's exciting, that's fun, that's enriching, all of that is true. But if as a teacher I can't recognize the learning inside of that demonstration, then it may not maximize its outcome. So we need to be keenly aware of that as we create these exciting opportunities for kids. In the background as teachers, we always have to be aware of our criteria. So when it comes to inquiry, when it comes to problem-based learning, we need to be fully aware that right now in the academic literature, there are mixed reviews for how project-based or problem-based learning is going. Now, from what I can see, a lot of that has to do with the quality of what we ask students to do. So there could be two teachers that say, hey, we both do project-based learning. One of them creates a very robust, very intense, kind of like deeply connected to what kids are curious about. And on the other hand, kids are just producing a diorama, as I've mentioned before. One creates a very enriching learning experience for kids, and the other one may not. So the point is, for me, that because of this mixed review, if you're engaged in performance assessment, project-based learning, problem-based learning, et cetera, inquiry, make sure that there's substance behind what the students are doing, and then you're eliciting sort of sophisticated evidence. That's that architecture piece. So a couple of things to be aware of when it comes to our assessment fundamentals. When you think about your performance assessments, the first consideration is intent. If you're going to generalize, think of a capstone project at the end of a semester. Think of something that is meant to, say, even some schools are experimenting with the idea of replacing a final exam with a capstone project or something like that, right? And that idea has been tossed around for several years now. We have to remind ourselves, by the way, that those two experiences are quite different. A final exam is designed for breadth. A final exam is designed to go wide. It's designed to cover the entire course. What's a capstone project designed to do? It's designed to go deep. Those are two different purposes, both valuable, but it's a decision about what we want that to really be. Do we want to go deep or do we want to go wide? And that's the decision. So even though a project can replace a final exam, absolutely, it may not be serving the same purpose that the exam served. And that's okay. We just have to be aware that we are repurposing the exam, for example. And that's just one example. But the point is, if you're going to generalize, then what's important is an adequate sampling. So at the nth degree, if I were going to have you do a capstone project to culminate an entire semester's worth of learning, and I was going to use that to basically generalize about how proficient you are with most, if not all, of the content in the class, then I need to make sure that that project adequately samples the learning from the entire semester. That's what adequate sampling. Assessment is always about adequate sampling, which means a sample is said to be adequate if you have enough information to form a fairly accurate judgment. Okay? That's why a lot of times in national polling, statistics in sports, et cetera, statisticians often talk about small sample sizes. Because if you have too small a sample, you may not be able to generalize. So if we had a national survey across Canada that surveyed 50 people on their political leanings, one would respond to that poll by saying, that's an inadequate sampling of the Canadian population. Two, if it's not generalizing, if you're more focused on a finite performance. So an example of a finite performance would be a unit project, a project that is a little more finite, but it's meant to demonstrate a finite piece of learning within a unit of study. If that's the case, then you'll be more specific with the task and more specific with your criteria. And if the performance assessment is meant to be formative in nature, that it's really focused on a more granular underpinning of the learning, then of course a more narrow focus is more fitting, right? So intent will allow you to go from as much breadth or specificity as necessary. So when you engineer these opportunities for kids, hey, we're going to do an inquiry-based project in science, right away you should think to yourself, what is my intent? Is my intent to be finite, generalized? Is my intent to be formative? Like, what are we doing? So on a granular and broad basis. Now, second to that is being clear on what you're looking for. So we have to be clear on both the content and the cognitive processes that are being assessed, right? So we have to have some clarity, like, what am I looking for? What's the substance to it? And you can think of this slide, if you will, sort of like a funnel. It funnels to specificity. So the broadest question is, what content and what cognitive processes am I assessing? Now get a little bit more specific. What performances will reveal proficiency with that content or that cognitive process? That middle bullet is where you build your rubrics. Now you ask yourself the third question, which is even more specific. What am I going to have you do in order to elicit those performances so I can then assess the content and the cognitive processes? So you can think of it almost like it narrows as you go down, right? What am I assessing? What does that look like? Now, what am I going to make you do? If you build your rubric around the third bullet, as soon as you change the task, we're going to have to build new criteria. If you build your criteria around the second bullet and you continue to change the tasks and anchor those around the curricular competencies, that criteria, those rubrics will be transferable throughout the semester, and you will, to the best of your ability, avoid the death by rubric spiral. So your intent and your clarity is important. And just to reiterate this is Susan Brookhart, who, again, one of our thought leaders in the research area of assessment and criteria. In her book, How to Create and Use Rubrics for Formative Assessment and Grading, she quite clearly articulates on page 15 that the biggest mistake teachers make when they use rubrics with performance assessment is that they focus on the task or the product and not the learning outcome or proficiency the task is supposed to get the students to demonstrate. So one opportunity for you going forward is to take a fresh look at some of your rubrics, the criteria you've established, and take a look and see if it is focused too heavily on the task or if it's more generalizable, okay? So here's an example, which I know for those of us who are in the room here is a super small font, and even for those of you around the province. But this is an example of a rubric, and you have this in your package, so you don't really need to look at the screen. But this is an example of an analytic rubric, and it's a rubric that is around analyzing and interpreting data. Now, what you'll notice is that when you look at the criteria, and this is just an example that comes from our new book, and you certainly could change the headings to align with the framework. I mean, that's no problem. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, certainly when we produced it, it was more for multiple contexts. But when you look at it, notice that for the most part, it really doesn't say what specific data you're looking at. I mean, this could be information that is that emerges from a chemistry experiment. This could be information that emerges from a physics experiment. That's what I mean when I say it's task neutral. It describes the idea of gathering information, organizing and presenting that information or data, making sense of the data. So much earlier in the webinar, you'll recall I said that we'll have to know our assessment purpose, and we'll still have to unpack and repack the learning. This is what I meant. So maybe the curricular competency is analyzing and interpreting data. We still have to unpack that to understand what the underpinnings of analyzing and interpreting data are. So formatively, I'm going to teach students how to gather appropriate data. I'm going to teach them how to organize and present the data. I'm going to teach them how to make sense of the data. I'm going to teach them those underpinnings. So what's on the left-hand side of the analytic rubric are the specific underpinnings that serve under the umbrella of analyzing and interpreting data. So as we think about, like, again, deriving meaning from the data, making data-based decisions, those are all things that initially you will instruct, teach, interact, give them some substance around that. And slowly over time, you'll have them do this in a more synthesized fashion, which then would allow you to say, here's your level of understanding around analyzing and interpreting data. So that's just an example of how you could create some task-neutral criteria that is transferable. And think of it both ways. Think about task-neutral criteria that could be latitudinally applicable. So you could create some criteria that is actually transferable across subjects. Because I can analyze and interpret data in science, but I can also do the same thing in my social studies class. Now, it's going to be different content, of course. That's the specificist view of critical thinking. You're thinking about something different. But the generalist view says the skill in and of itself is transferable. So that's where we can borrow from both, right? So a couple other examples. I know that a lot of people are beginning to work toward using a third type of rubric. There's the holistic rubric, there's the analytic rubric, but recently we've started to see a lot more teachers using a single point rubric. Is anybody here using a single point rubric? Yeah. So one of the advantages of the single point rubric, of course, is both practical and theoretically beneficial. Practically speaking, a single point rubric is easy to create. I mean, what you have down the center of the document is simply your top tier of sophistication, your most sophisticated level of demonstration. Now, that doesn't mean kids can't push past that, but again, we have to know what we're looking for, and the students have to know what the target is. On the left-hand side, you have a space to articulate descriptive feedback on what needs strengthening, and on the right-hand side, you have the opportunity to articulate that which is already strong. So the theoretical advantage here is that this tool allows for more specific, more granular feedback to students. Of course, that can be more labor-intensive if we're not careful, but this tool can also be a great tool to use for student self-assessment and peer assessment, which distributes the labor across the students. Students have to be taught about that, and we will, in webinar number 3, talk a little bit about the importance of self-assessment, because that is obviously one of the skills we want kids to learn how to do. They have to be taught how to do that. The other thing that I've shared with you also is this scale, and these are simply examples. They're not meant to be definitive. They're not meant to be, hey, you need to use these. These are simply examples. The other thing that we talk a lot about, my colleagues and I, is not just teaching. You don't have this one in there? It's not in there? Oh, okay. I thought it was in your package. I will make this one available to you at another time. So I'll make it available. My apologies. I thought it was in there, but it's not. It's okay. So what you're looking at here, and so what I'll do for those or the participants, I'll add this to the handout for webinar number 2, so you have it, okay? So the point is here that in the overarching look at critical thinking, not only do we want students to learn how to think critically, but we want students to become critical thinkers dispositionally. That critical thinking is my dispositional default. So here's an example of how you could use a tool to help kids either self-assess or you could assess their disposition. So as an example, when I can compare and contrast, when I can hypothesize, when I can synthesize, when I can analyze, when I can do all of those things, that's me using a critical thinking skill. But notice some of the criteria down the left side. I ask questions to further my understanding of the challenge at hand. That's a dispositional default. So when we teach kids to become critical thinkers, it isn't just can you operationally use the skill of critical thinking, but do you actually dispositionally think critically? So much so that we would hope that students dispositionally become critical thinkers so that they think critically when they're lost at the mall. Like when they don't know what to do in a certain situation. Because when I can operationally do the critical thinking skill, that's one thing. If I am someone who does not rush to judgment until I have all of the information, that's a dispositional default that is universally applicable. So that's the skill and the will of critical thinking. So that's just an example of not just operationally teaching kids how to think critically, but we actually want them to become critical thinkers. And the good news is we're already doing a lot of this in our classroom. The only difference might be the level of intentionality with which we articulate it, because that will help the students self-assess and be aware of how they're learning to become more critical thinkers. So our final question, our final pause and ponder, and I want this to be 10 minutes, but we don't have enough time to make this 10 minutes, so we're just going to give you a few minutes for this conversation. I want to ask you 2 questions, and you can go in either direction, and of course, with the limited amount of time, pick one. What are some of the successes you've had with eliciting authentic, sophisticated evidence through performance assessment? So think about your project-based learning as one example of how you might have done that. Or what are some of the challenges that you've faced in trying to elicit that authentic, sophisticated evidence through a performance assessment or a project-based learning experience. We're probably looking at more like 6 or 7 minutes for this quick conversation, so it might be better to split up into smaller groups so that everybody has a chance to have that conversation. But again, I'll leave it with you for the next 6 minutes or so, and then we'll come back together for some final comments in closing out the webinar, okay? Go ahead. All right, I'd like to invite you back together as a large group, and as we begin to wrap up our session together, bring you back together. We've just got about 5 minutes or so remaining, and I just want to sort of set up where we're going next time. So I've sort of called this the homework. It's not required. It's not for marks. But if you, yes, this is going to be on the test. If you could look at page 8 of the handout, what you'll see there is a detailed survey on the assessment tenets that I went through. It's a little bit more detail in its description. And when you look at this, what I'm asking you to do, if you so choose, is to take inventory on your own assessment practices. On the left-hand side, you are going to self-assess on your level of expertise with each of the tenets. And the scale that I've presented there, which is not, it's because of the font size, it was hard to squeeze the words in, but the E begins, if you think you have an exemplary level of understanding with that tenet, put a check there. Exemplary, proficient. If you feel that you're just developing in that area, or you might feel you're a novice in that area, that's up to you to decide. That's your level of expertise. On the right-hand side, so again, exemplary. If you feel fairly competent, then call yourself proficient. If you feel you're kind of in the midst of it, then you're developing and then a novice. On the right-hand side, what you're looking at is how you implement. Do you implement consistently? Do you do this on a consistent basis? Do you do this usually? Do you do this sometimes, or do you do it rarely? Now, what you'll end up with is 12 check marks, identifying areas for you that are areas of expertise and areas of consistent implementation. You may also discover in your own self-assessment some aspects of assessment that could be a focal point for your professional learning going forward. I don't know how the survey is going to turn out for each and every one of you, but it's sort of a chance to just take a quick check and inventory on that. So that's the first thing. The second thing you'll see in the package, if you turn the page on page 9, is a fairly good description of the 3 types of rubrics, the analytic rubric, the holistic rubric, and the single point rubric. And you'll see across the top there's a description of each, and then there are both the advantages and disadvantages of each of the tools. So just like we talked about with assessment methods, there's no rubric that's superior to another. It depends on what your intent is with the tool. Then use the tool that is most appropriate. So what I'd like you to do with that, should you have time, is to take a look at how you make decisions about what format you use. Do you have a typical format of rubric development? If so, does the reason you choose that typical format match what the advantage is for that tool? Or if you don't have a typical format, if you tend to use analytic, holistic, and single point rubrics altogether, then reflect on how you make that decision. What is it that goes into how you make the decision about which tool is most applicable? And then the third piece is just on your own, examine the curricular competencies or continue to examine the curricular competencies as the instructional focal point, as I mentioned earlier, to capitalize on many of your current practices, but to also maybe revamp some of the practices that might need some tweaking and refinement. So when we come together next time, we are going to focus more on 2 big ideas on February 13th. We're going to talk about 2 things that often get misconstrued. One is a progression of learning. And a progression of learning or a learning progression is how we lead students through simple to sophisticated. So as an example, moving students from knowledge to understanding to application to analysis, etc. Moving students through Bloom's taxonomy to the level of sophistication that we're hoping they will demonstrate, that's a learning progression. At the same time, when you develop a rubric, what you're developing is a progression of quality. Those are two different things, and we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into those two big ideas on the 13th. Okay? So for my part, I just want to thank you all for being here and joining us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Heather for some closing comments as we finish out today. So thank you so much, and we'll turn it over to Heather. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.